Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to another episode of Ушанка Show. Здравствуйте, мальчики и девочки. В эфире программа Ушанка Show. In today's video, we will continue our conversation about Soviet emergency services. We already talked about calling fire department. You call 01, calling militia, Soviet version of police, 02, and now it's time to dial 03 and call Soviet ambulance. Call Skoraya Pomosch. Out of all Soviet emergency services, 01 firefighters, пожарники, 02 police, militia, 03 Soviet ambulance was probably called most often by Soviet people. My family called them at least twice, what I recall, in 20 years of living in the USSR. But we'll talk about it a little bit later, and right now let's start with a short lesson of Russian language, урок русского языка. Ambulance in Russian is Skoraya медицинская помощь, so it's 3 words. Skoraya means speedy, медицинская, so like medicine, medical, and помощь, help. So speedy medical help. Skoraya медицинская помощь. Ambulance. But in everyday life, people just say Skoraya Pomosch, speedy help, and everyone understands that's speedy medical help, it's ambulance. And in case of emergency, when somebody will tell you, hey, call ambulance, and they're gonna just tell you, call Skoraya, позвони в скорую. And everyone knows that you call in the speedy, the only speedy service people need right now, it's medical help. They need ambulance. Позвони в скорую. So if you hear anyone saying позвони в скорую медицинскую помощь, you know the guy is an American spy and he needs to be arrested. For example, there's the old poster, probably from 1930s, that says «Скорая помощь выезжает только при несчастных случаях». So speedy help will arrive only during the accidents. If you get sick, you need to go to the hospital. При заболевании обращайтесь в районные пункты помощи на дому. As I mentioned earlier, I believe my family called the ambulance at least twice. That's what I remember for sure. And first time was really kind of sad circumstances. And I mentioned the story in one of my earlier videos. So my grandparents on my mother's side, Sergei and Maria, they helped us to purchase our 3-room apartment. All they had in their savings was 3,000 rubles, and we needed 5,000 for down payment. So they helped us with the down payment. By agreement was when they get too old, you won't be able to stay in their log cabin in the village in the winter. They can come to our place and they'll have a separate room. So that was kind of agreement that we had. So in November of 1982, at that time I was 11, I think it was 1982, my grandparents moved to our place and moved them in. They hired a collective farm truck, which wasn't a moving truck, just, open truck. And, they put their belongings in the back and they rode with the driver. Unfortunately, my grandfather decided to take along a small bottle of moonshine. He always had a 1 shot of alcohol before every meal. And I don't know why he decided to have a small bottle in his pocket just to have a little sip here and there. Maybe he was stressed out, I don't know. And some vodka got spilled in his pocket, so there was a strong smell of alcohol in the cab. And the driver said, dude, if I get pulled over, I will be in trouble because GAI, traffic police, will smell alcohol. So he asked my grandpa to go in the back and sit in the back of the truck in the open, cargo area. And of course, there was November, it was really cold. So by the time they got to Kiev, and I'm not sure when exactly he had to go in the back, but the total distance like 250 kilometers. So he was really cold and he already had a problem with lungs. He always had like a bronchitis going on. So it got way worse and he got very sick shortly after arriving to Kiev. So that's when my mom called ambulance, called Skoraya, and doctors came and checked my grandpa, but unfortunately they couldn't help him much. They gave him some shots, antibiotics, but he was just way too weak, and about a month later he passed away. So of course it was quite a shock and tragedy for our family because we were trying to help our grandparents, and as a result my grandpa passed away before his time, but of course, no one to blame but him. And his second ambulance call involved myself. So I believe it was maybe 86 or 87. Anyway, we started having Fanta drinks available. Before that, it was only Pepsi. Like I'm talking about the foreign brands. available in the Soviet Union. Now we had Fanta, so I purchased a bottle, and I was watching some show in the living room, and I was just drinking, and it's like 0.33 liter bottle Fanta. I finished the whole bottle, and shortly after I got violently sick. I was puking, I didn't feel good, and my mom decided to call ambulance. They came, they checked me out, they said there was really nothing wrong with me, and they thought probably it was the drink. And since that day, I had never touched the Fanta again in my life, ever. And now let's talk about Soviet ambulance vehicles. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and of course I lived in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. So what I remember mostly is RAF 2203. There's like a minivan looking vehicle, and that's was the one usually on the road in the late 70s, early 80s. I believe it was introduced in 1977 and it was manufactured for 10 years till 1987. RAF 2203. The very first Soviet-made ambulance vehicle was this beauty called AMOF-15. It was manufactured back in 1925. Wasn't really a great vehicle, and I believe that's the vehicle that's shown in the poster about Skoraya Pomosch. And only by the mid-1930s, when Americans finished building Ford car assembly factory in Nizhny Novgorod, they began manufacturing GAZ-AA trucks, and also based on that truck, they started manufacturing ambulance vehicles like you see at this picture. And that's the truck you can see in the most popular Soviet comedy of all times, Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, Caucasian Captive. That's a GAZ-AA ambulance truck. This ambulance truck was actually made for the military and had room for 4 stretchers, but since there was no other options available for the civil service, they utilized a lot of these trucks in every city, especially large cities like Moscow and Kyiv. Like this one is actually from Kyiv. After the end of World War II, they started building ambulance cars based on the Soviet limo ZIS 110A, and it's pretty interesting. It's really, I mean, it's a huge car, but still it's not a lot of room inside, but I've probably had a smoother ride than any trucks, so that's the ones you could see in the cities, and I think they look pretty cool. Later in 1950s, a new Soviet limousine, this time it was a GAZ-12, GAZ-12, was also manufactured as the ambulance car. Also in 1950s, they began manufacturing ambulance vehicles based on a GAZ-51 truck. That was one of the most mass-produced truck in the world ever. They manufactured GAZ-51 for a long time. I think there was several millions of them produced. And they made quite a few of ambulance vehicles, although personally I don't recall ever seeing anything like that on the road. I don't know about you guys, but going through these vehicles, I had the feeling that it was always a shortage of ambulance cars in the Soviet Union, and periodically the Soviet government, remember, it was a centrally planned economy. Soviet government would probably get enough complaints from towns and villages, so they will just throw an order, okay, take this vehicle and make so many ambulance cars. So definitely those limos, ZIS, they know good in the villages, going off-roading, so that was probably serving Moscow, maybe Kyiv, Leningrad. And only by late 1960s, there was finally a vehicle that could do ambulance service in the distant villages and towns, so it was capable to go off-road, and that's the famous UAZ Bukhanka minivan. Bukhanka is the word that describes a specific type of bread that's shaped as a brick, Bukhanka, and of course you see the resemblance because UAZ minivan look like Bukhanka as well. That's why that nickname stuck. Although ambulance version of UAZ got a different nickname, Tabletka, which means the pill. And some of you gearheads and car lovers may notice there is a similarities between Soviet Bukhanka and American Jeep FC-150. I neither can confirm nor deny any allegations, but it definitely looks like Soviet Bukhanka design was inspired, in fact, by Jeep FC-150. So American Jeep forward control was manufactured between 1956 and 1965. After that, he was discontinued. Soviet UAZ Bukhanka was manufactured in 1965 all the way to present day. So it's still being made right now in modern day Russia. I don't know how many of you have seen this awesome Back to the Future meme. Doc, which year is that? Somewhere between 1965 and 2023. We are at the UAZ factory, so I'm not really sure. In the end of 1950s, the shortage of ambulance cars in Soviet Union was so severe that government decided to import some from socialist Czechoslovakia. They brought an ambulance version of Škoda 1201, which was called Sanitka, so sounds like Sanitarka ambulance. And you could see those cars only on the large cities like Moscow and Leningrad. Then by mid-1960s, we started getting ambulance vehicle based on a RAF, Riga Aerobus factory from Latvia. So that minivan was just the perfect size to do the job. It had enough room to have a medical crew of 3 people, 2 nurses and a doctor to do their job. And there was still enough room to put a patient in. And over the years, this was pretty much on the streets everywhere in the Soviet Union. And on this photo, you see kind of basic setup of the RAF ambulance. So you have a nice access, big side door, big swing open back door. There's a room for extra stretcher. It's almost like a bunk bed, so pretty decent. And just for the comparison, this is the ambulance version of Volga station wagon, which we're going to talk about next. And as you see, huge difference. Definitely RAF Latvia van was way better as an ambulance vehicle than Volga. Unfortunately, Riga Aerobus factory wasn't manufacturing enough of those minivans, so Soviet government ordered to also make ambulance vehicles based on the Volga station wagons. And I remember seeing those on the streets quite a bit, even in the 70s and 80s. And of course, we had random ambulance vehicles like this. I believe it's 1959 Nisa bus. And I couldn't find out where it was manufactured, maybe Poland. And they even used UAZ Bobik SUVs, which is definitely not good vehicle for the ambulance work, but it could be delivering just a doctor to see a patient. And of course, I must mention this funky looking ambulance vehicle based on the microbus ZL 118. This one was a special ambulance vehicle for the special Soviet people and even called Специализированная Skoraya Pomosch, specialized Speedy Medical Help. As you may know, in Soviet Union we had free healthcare, and it was so great that ministers and other important Soviet apparatchiks wanted to have special medical care, so they created so-called 4th Department of the Ministry of Health, and it had special hospitals, special ambulance vehicles that took care of special Soviet people. But when it comes to the regular Soviet people, RAF 977 became obsolete by the mid-1970s, and Riga guys designed a new RAF 2203, and that pretty much became the most popular, most mass-produced ambulance version of any vehicles in the Soviet Union. From 1977 till 1987, they manufactured tons of those, and that's what I remember, like the main vehicle I've seen on the streets of Kiev is RAF 2203 ambulance car. You may already noticed that the main color scheme for the Soviet ambulance vehicles was white vehicle with red stripes, red doors, number 03, that's the number you call, and Skoraya Medicинская Pomosch, Speedy Medical Help on its side. By the mid-1980s, you could see some yellow and red ambulance vehicles, usually in Moscow and Leningrad. I believe those were modified by the Finnish company into ambulance, and that's why they had different color scheme. And now let's talk about people who worked at the Soviet ambulances. Like you see on this picture, you have a driver on the right, and on the left, it's maybe a doctor or a nurse, medbrat or medsestra. So a standard crew of the Soviet ambulance vehicle consisted of a driver, and it's all he had to do just to drive. Then a qualified ambulance doctor and 1 or 2 so-called feldshery, so that's nurses. That's the one that will help doctor, and also they will carry a patient using stretchers. When I was researching for this video, I discovered that working as ambulance doctor or ambulance nurse was really hard, unthankful job, mostly because the majority of phone calls, emergency medical phone calls, were due to the drunk people. So people would had too much alcohol and then they feel sick, or they puked, or they hurt themselves, or they family members. So they dealt a lot with drunk people, and of course that could be really stressful, especially on a night shift. My high school friend Alex actually worked as an ambulance doctor, but it happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he hated the job. He had to work night shifts. There was pretty much, if you didn't have blood, if you didn't have connections, you're gonna end up working in ambulance, because the good jobs would be working at some hospital. And his stories were pretty interesting, but as I said, quite depressing. A lot of dealing with drunks. And he told me they didn't want to waste drugs on drunk people, so they would inject just the pure water in their butt cheeks. It will create a lot of pain, but of course there will be no medical effect. So that was pretty much like punishment for this, useless emergency phone calls, because people didn't need any care. They were just too drunk, and maybe wife thought he had a heart attack or something. There's only kind of interesting story he told me that one day, I believe that was a day shift though, that crew was just taking a break between calls, and it was a hot summer day, so they were parked, and of course no air conditioning in the Soviet ambulance vehicles. So they just parked on the side of the street, doors wide open, including back door, and the doctor was just writing a report. And suddenly this guy staggered towards him and started mumbling like, "Dude, I'm dying. I'm gonna die." And he's like, "Oh, another drunk." So he told him, "Go away." So this person stumbled around the vehicle and collapsed inside of the ambulance van, because the doors were wide open. And sure enough, he was having a heart attack. It was hot weather, dude was overweight. So they saved him because he was just lucky enough to find the ambulance vehicle, and he fell right inside. And of course, because a lot of drunk people could be extremely violent, ambulance had to work as a team together with cops, with militia, so quite often you could see Soviet police vehicle next to the Soviet ambulance vehicle coming for the same call. So like on this photo, there's a drunk being treated for head injury, and you see the lady is smiling and holding his ears. So apparently, no matter how drunk you are, they could wake you up from your stupor by pulling your ears extremely hard. So that's what that lady is doing. So this picture was taken in modern day Ukraine maybe about 10 years ago. So this is a classic example. A guy was on military leave, got too drunk, probably got his ass kicked, puked all over, including his own hat, and now he is being on a stretcher in an ambulance car. And of course you understand that extremely drunk people, besides being aggressive, they also piss themselves, they shit themselves, they puke all over. So it was a lot of nasty work to be done, and for not a decent pay and not really great benefits. Well, sometimes there are benefits, like you could use the ambulance vehicle if it's all-wheel drive to go mushroom hunting like this crew did. Okay, my friends, it's all I could tell you about Soviet ambulance. I hope you enjoyed this story and maybe learned something new. As always, please don't forget to like this video, maybe share with your friends if you have any, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.